In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Shortly after, he made two humans that had never sinned, genetically perfect, so that their children could marry each other with no genetic problems. Incest is bad now, but wasn't then. That's a popular view, at least. While seemingly simple, this raises all sorts of questions of what it means to be genetically perfect. Today, two scientists join me to discuss how we are to think about the idea of an original, genetically perfect Adam and Eve. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great. Happy to be
Awesome.
here.
All right. So, people are familiar with Dr. Duff's work here, but can you tell us your background, Dr. Dan?
Hi, everybody. My name is Dan. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I have a PhD in genetics and microbiology, and I teach a bunch of biology at the college level. So this is my field, and I love
Awesome. And
talking
you have a
about it.
YouTube channel too. Both of you guys do.
Yes, my channel is called Creation Myths, where I talk about evolution and creationism.
Thanks for that, Dan. And for those new to my channel, I'm a biblical studies student who interviews scholars on how Genesis interacts with science, as well as other important topics for Christians. If that's something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe to the channel to make sure you're aware of what's going on over here.
I'm Dr. Joel Duff, and I talk about the intersection of science and faith.
Awesome. All right. So, uh, the big question here. We're talking about incest. There seems to be a discussion in science about whether it's bad and all this other stuff. Um, why would you say that incest is bad? Like, why does it have bad outcomes even today?
We're talking about incest,
It's
really? Is
so
that what I came on for? Woo! All right, Dan, you better take that one.
that's what we're doing. All right, so little bit of background before we get to like the specific topic. A little bit of just genetics background. So humans are what we call diploid, which means we have two of every gene. You get one complete set from mom, one complete set from dad, and then for some genetic traits, not all of them, not even a lot of them, but for some genetic traits, they're controlled by a single gene, and the whatever trait you have is basically what version of that do you have from mom and what version of that do you have from dad, and how those two versions of the same gene interact with each other. A really good example of this that's really easy to understand is blood type, right? So you could be A or B or O, and the A and B versions of that gene, which are called alleles. That word allele just means version of a gene. So you could have the allele for A or B or O for blood type. A and B are what we call dominant, and O
Hmm.
is recessive. Meaning, if your genes for your blood type are say AO, then you're going to have type A blood because the A covers up the O, and you don't see the O in
Hmm.
the actual trait, right? So there are a lot of genetic disorders that are
Hmm.
recessive like that. Things like sickle cell disease or phenylketonuria or cystic fibrosis, where if you have one copy from mom of whatever gene it is that works correctly and one copy from dad that works correctly, you're good. If you have one copy that works correctly and one copy that doesn't work, you're still good as long as you have that one working copy. But if you have two copies that don't work, and the word for that is homozygous, means you have two of the same. If you're homozygous for the recessive version that doesn't work, then you have whatever
Hmm.
the disease is. So the danger with inbreeding, which is when close relatives reproduce with each other, is that you could have one copy of that gene, in the grandparents or the great grandparents or the great grandparents, right? You go back a few generations and you only have one copy, but that one copy works its way through multiple, individuals through that
Hmm.
family tree. And then you could have like cousins or something that have kids, and they both contribute that broken copy, so then their kid could be homozygous recessive and have whatever that
Hmm.
disease is, right? That's the
Okay.
problem, where you increase the likelihood of that happening when close relatives
Okay.
reproduce with each other.
And what kind of
That's the issue.
diseases does that tend to have when you, I guess, what is it called, inbreeding? I don't know.
Yeah, so that kind of interbreeding between close relatives is called inbreeding, and there's a way to measure that like there's math. It's called the inbreeding coefficient. We don't have to worry about that. But the types of diseases are these recessive disorders. Kind of the classic one that you think of is going to be sickle cell disease, where as long as you have one copy of the hemoglobin gene that works correctly, you're not going to have sickle cell disease. But if you have two copies of it, then your hemoglobin doesn't form quite right and it sticks together in these long chains, and that causes the red blood cells to form into these rigid sickle shapes instead of the flexible discs that they normally are. And that can impede blood flow, it could cause anemia, and there's a bunch of other things associated with it. That's kind of the classic one. Another one that people have probably heard of is cystic fibrosis, which is, it has to do with a molecular little tunnel in the cells, but the symptoms typically have to do with fluid buildup in the lungs because this little molecular tunnel doesn't work right. Fluid builds up, and then it leads to difficulty breathing and a predisposition to certain types of pneumonia is another one that's fairly common, and generally you hear about that
Very,
one.
very helpful. Okay. All right. So, for the background context of this conversation of incest and all that, we're talking about a typical idea in mostly young Earth creationist circles where you have Adam and Eve are created and they're the only humans out there, and then they have kids. Well, there's kids. They have to have kids somehow, right? So many postulate, hey, there wasn't anyone outside of the garden. Therefore, Cain must have got his wife from someone, and that someone had to be a sibling. And that makes things really awkward because it's like, okay, well, isn't inbreeding or marrying siblings, doesn't that cause bad outcomes? Well, the solution to this, okay, they're perfect. Their genes are perfect. But today we're going to talk about why that might be tricky, or maybe we'll find out exactly. So let me discuss, I guess, a common, I guess, more scientific version of that. So in the Creation Answers Book 1, which is like what is that, like the answers in Genesis, like answers, they have a bunch of questions and they're like, we're going to give you the answer on this, the solution to the problem. And so they discuss this in their book. They say, since going forward in time means that a population will have more and more genetic mistakes, going back in time means that there are fewer and fewer such mistakes. Ultimately, one could extrapolate that back to a situation in which there were no defects. This makes sense in a biblical framework of understanding, since the first man and woman, created in a perfect world before it was corrupted by sin, would not have any defective genes. Remember, God pronounces creation very good. After the fall, such copying mistakes would now arise, but it would take time, many generations, including hundreds of years, for the mistakes to accumulate, add up to a level at which it would be significant for brother to marry sister. In other words, Cain or any of his brothers could have married his sister without any biological problem. Can Dr. Dan, can you maybe restate this in maybe more simpler terms, or however you want to describe it, like, their position, I guess, and just to make sure that, like, my audience understands this discussion well. Okay.
I will try. So, my understanding of this argument is that you can have inbreeding early in human history after creation, because we're operating within a young Earth paradigm here. So you're looking at 6,000-ish years ago, and then you have to do this again 4,000-ish years ago after
Oh, yes.
the Ark, right? Because now you only have a handful of people getting off the Ark. So same thing. But whichever part of that you want to look at, the idea is that everyone's genome is basically good or perfect to where you don't have any of those recessive alleles that could cause disease. So the likelihood of, somebody over here and somebody over here, they're siblings or first cousins or whatever, they have kids together. You're not going to have that situation where you increase the frequency of recessive genetic disorders because those alleles simply aren't there yet in the population, or they're not there at high enough levels that you're going to encounter two people who share the same thing, right? That's the idea, that you set it up where it's perfect at the beginning so you don't have whatever frequency of the disorders that we have now, so you don't have to worry about it.
Anything you want to add there, Dr. Duff?
Oh yeah, I would just add the second part of that argument then from Answers in Genesis, or really many other Christians who have reflected upon this, is
Okay.
that um, you finally have the edict against incest around the time, what is it, Moses, right, in the
Mm,
time of the Egyptians. And so that argument goes like, well, that's how long it's taken to build up enough genetic load, right? Enough mutations that would cause serious deleterious effects, so that at that point, God must have instituted this rule in order to basically save humans from themselves in a way. Now,
mm,
I would add, it's really important, and this is what maybe Dan and I can get into when we get into sort of the genetics of this, and that is, if you're starting with two people, then you have an expansion of a population, and there's a lot of debate about how much expansion there would have been in 1600 years, but many young Earth creationists believe there could have been millions and millions of people alive at the time of the flood, um, especially when you have that long of a lifespan and you have that many offspring from each of those. And presumably there was less disease. And I mean, if you think about the ramifications of a perfect genome, before we get to
mm,
what perfect means, but if you have these perfect genomes or near perfect genomes, then you're going to have individuals that are thriving and surviving presumably better, and that's why you're going to have that many more offspring before the flood. Well, then you then have a bottleneck, right? So we're going to have to really deal with the fact that you have Noah, and his sons and their wives. So it's a very few number of individuals, and that's essentially a grab of a small subset of the total population of alleles, the variants that are in the population. And so we need to talk about like how many variants there could have been in two individuals at the beginning, then how many new variants are created in that expansion of the population, and then what happens when you randomly select, that upon that group. What are the chances that two individuals in that group would have some kind of deleterious negative, well, let's just call them, to make it simple, disease causing alleles. Um, and so even by that point, one might argue that there already potentially could be problems with incest even at the time of Noah. And then the question
mm,
becomes, why wait all the way until the time of Moses? Because that's a yet another very large expansion of the human population before you get to that particular point. So the question is going to, some of the questions revolve around like, how many total mutations or deleterious alleles would you build up in a population that amount of time?
mm,
And then I think I would like to discuss, what was the scriptural intent? Was this even Moses' intent to, or we'll say God's intent to somehow protect people from mutations and deleterious alleles, or is there another reason for the edict about incest?
mm. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Alrighty. So, Dr. Dan first, then Joel can comment if he wants to. From your perspective as a scientist, is it theoretically possible? I'm not even saying if it's likely, okay? I'm saying, is it theoretically possible if for it to be genetically possible for someone to have a genome without any mutated genes which cause disease?
Yeah, I'm with Joel on this. I mean, I think there's no I'll say at the
Okay.
kind of at the beginning here, if we're assuming, special creation of Adam and Eve 6,000-ish years ago, right? We're talking creation via an
Uh-huh.
omnipotent creator. So, like, sure, they can have whatever alleles you're going to be in
Uh-huh.
there. That's fine, right? You can make that happen. Realistically, in a realistic size population, given the rate at which mutations occur in the human genome and the number of genes and just how many I'll say disease associated alleles that
Mm,
we know of, the likelihood of having, like, even pretty shortly after that creation event, the likelihood of having a genome with no recessive harmful alleles is quite
hmm,
low and approaches, zero very, very quickly once that population starts to expand, I think, given just kind of the amount of things that can go wrong in the human genome if you assume that, say, there are no alleles for things like sickle cell or cystic fibrosis or any one of the other bajillion alleles that we know exist that cause problems. You assume none of those exist at the beginning. There's a lot of option, there's a lot of opportunities to generate those within a relatively short time once your population
Mm-hmm.
starts to expand. And one thing that's kind of a feature of, I won't say all, but, and Joel, you're probably in a better position to characterize this than I am, but I'm going to say most young Earth models involve exponential population expansions fairly early in their history. So once you get that, you start getting into a lot of these mutations are going to creep into the population fairly quickly. But there is another side of this that I think that's worth pointing out, because we're talking about this starting point of like a perfect genome, and in evolution, that's not a thing that exists, because what is good and what is bad and what is beneficial and what is harmful, aside from a few fairly clear-cut cases, all of that is going to be context dependent. So like geographically where the garden is located on Earth, in the tropics and the subtropics and the temperate regions, that's going to actually dictate what is perfect for that environment. But even if, humans start radiating out from there, I guess it would be radiating after, Babel, right? From wherever that is geographically, even if you assume no mutations are building up in those populations, just the geographic changing latitude means that what they had in one place that was perfect is no longer perfect in the new place. So you actually need mutations to stay perfect as you move from place to place, because what works best in one environment doesn't in another. And a really simple example of this is skin color, where in the tropics, dark skin is the best. It's the most adaptive, because we humans, we have this trade-off between synthesizing vitamin D, which we need, which requires UV radiation, and skin cancer if we get too much UV radiation. So we have this trade-off where in the tropics, you get more UV radiation than you need. So darker skin is adaptive to protect you from that UV radiation. As you move to the higher and higher latitudes, lighter and lighter skin becomes more adaptive, because the pendulum swings in the other way, where skin cancer becomes much less of a concern, and just getting enough UV radiation to synthesize all the vitamin D you need to stay healthy is the overriding concern. So assuming that, the Garden of Eden or Mount Ararat or Tower of Babel, wherever we're starting our radiation from around the world, assuming that's somewhere, in the tropics or the subtropics, the mid-latitudes, as human populations move to the higher latitudes, north and south, whatever genes were optimal there, they're no longer optimal as you move, and you better have mutations. Otherwise, you're going to have a really tough time living, up in Siberia, in Europe, in South Africa, right? You're no longer going to be fit for those environments once you leave where you started. So it's this thing where you could talk about what is good or what is perfect or what is optimal for a specific location, but that's not going to apply universally to every population everywhere, which is an important
Okay.
caveat to all
All right,
of
that's
this.
helpful.
Yeah.
So, I just got a couple clarification questions, and you can join in, Joel. Um, so the first, if I want to try and summarize what you said there, seems like you said yes, it's theoretically possible for Adam and Eve to be created without any mutated genes that cause disease, but not for long. Like very shortly after those things would crop up, right? And when you say shortly after, are you talking Tower of Babel, or are you talking Cain and Abel? How quickly are you talking?
I would think within a
Few
few
generations, okay.
generations, and I'm basing this on what I've read about young Earth models where we have very rapid population growth. And even in the Answers book, where Ken Ham talks about like Cain and Abel and siblings and whatnot, they're talking about, we don't know how many siblings there were. It could have been a few, it could have been hundreds, right? You look at how long everybody lived, it could have been a
Hmm.
really long time. So
Um,
quite quickly, you would expect stuff to crop up within a
okay.
few
All right. And then you
generations.
talked about genes, whether, a good little intro as far as some genes are good in some environments and others are not good. So what perfect is completely contextual. So I guess what
Yes.
most young Earth creationists means when they say the genes are perfect, someone like Ken Ham is thinking perfect in regards to doesn't cause disease. So would that change your
Mhm.
answer at all in regards to what is considered perfect? Like, is that a concept that makes any sense?
I think it's still kind of the same because, like, if you have, for example, if you originate kind of in the tropics, right? So you're created with darker skin to protect you from the amount of sunlight you get, but still facilitate vitamin D synthesis. If you don't change those genes at all, you're going to have a vitamin D deficiency if you move elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? If there's no, so it can be the case that they are created wherever they're, wherever geographically they are,
Mm-hmm.
that's perfect. But without having any mutations, that can
Gotcha.
still be
Okay,
not
Joel, what
perfect.
do you? Yeah, what?
If that makes
Yeah,
sense, right? It could be perfect
yeah. So,
and not
Joel, what are your
perfect.
thoughts on all that?
Oh, Dan brought up one of the same examples I would give, and that whole idea of trade off that we have many different allele. Well, we have many different genes for which one version or one gene is working in one way, and if in under a different condition, another set of genes is more important. There's going to be a constant trade offs in our body, and I think about examples like, well, let's just think about how would you not have mutations? How would you not have errors? I mean, I've often asked young Earth creationists, like, okay, so you have this original genome. If Adam hadn't sinned, how would you prevent mutations from happening?
Hmm.
They say, well, we have God built us with mechanisms like DNA error correcting mechanisms, but even those aren't perfect. There's still going to be errors because of chemistry. But the thing is that we have trade offs in our own body. We could have a much lower error rate than we do, but it takes a lot of energy, right? You have to expend a lot of energy in order to cut down on the errors. In other words, you have to put all your energy into error correction. Kind of like your immune system. You could prevent yourself from getting a lot of additional diseases if you ramped up your immune system even more, in a sense. But you'd use so much energy doing that, you couldn't go out and collect food for yourself, and you would die because you didn't expend any energy in that way. We're all making those trade-offs.
Hmm.
We could live longer, but we don't live as long because we're much more protective of our younger self. We ramp up our error correcting mechanisms early in our life, but that actually damages our body so that we won't live as long later. We kind of spiral down faster. We could
Hmm.
spread that out a little bit more, but you'd have a higher risk of dying earlier from cancer because you wouldn't be working as hard to prevent cancer because of those errors. But if you happen to avoid that cancer, you would live a longer period of time. So we're all in this weird balance, this interesting balance of
Hmm.
trading off, like, well, I could do this, but if I did that, I can't do that.
Hmm.
And so that's true for all organisms in all places and all times. And that's what Dan's saying. You move to a different environment, the trade-offs are going to be different. And so that
Hmm.
causes you to readjust, or selection is going to readjust the values there,
Hmm.
which alleles are more important in those situations. I'm going to throw one little odd thing at you just to illustrate what Dan's also saying about the increased error rate and like how many errors would occur.
Okay.
So if I just follow through on the logic of young Earth creationists, I say, like, if people are living for hundreds of years and they're having offspring for hundreds of years, we know that, everything we know in the present about people today is that if you father a child when you're 55, 60 years old, you have a much higher number of errors that occur, many more mutations in those sperm. And so you have a much higher chance of having a Down syndrome child, or, there's a whole list of things for which
Hmm.
your chances of passing on a mutation are much greater at a greater age. So imagine if you're several hundred years old, and that's what would be necessary for this population growth. That just interjects a much greater error rate into the process.
Hmm. Yeah, that is very scientifically challenging and confusing, complicated very quickly.
There's it gets really that's the fun thing
Yeah.
about biology. It gets really complicated
Hmm.
really fast. There's one more kind of wrinkle I
Okay.
want to add to this, which is this side of things. So we're talking about the rate at which mutations are going to get into the population, the rate at which, if you start perfectly, what's the rate at which we're going to see changes away from that
Okay.
perfect starting state. And I think we all agree that, like, God could make them perfect, and whatever that means, right? Either they're going to be homozygous, meaning they have the same alleles that are perfect, or maybe they're the opposite of that, where they have two different things. That's called, for a specific gene, they have two different versions, but they're both good. They don't cause any problems. They're both perfect, even though there's two different versions of it. That's called heterozygous. The problem in terms of making this work as like a coherent model is that there is no observed mechanism of genetics where you can start with Adam and Eve and whatever level of diversity that they start with 6,000 years ago, go through the flood bottleneck 4,000 years ago, and then get the amount of genetic diversity we see in modern humans today, right? There just isn't enough time to go from those small families to modern, like the amount of diversity we see across all of humanity, given the rate at which mutations occur, the rate at which they accumulate, the rate of recombination. You just can't get a buildup of variation fast enough from that time frame to get to where we are today. So is it theoretically possible to create two perfect humans 6,000 years ago that have perfect genomes, however we would characterize that? Absolutely, that is possible for an omnipotent creator, right? But is it possible to go from that state to the level of genetic diversity we see across all of Homo sapiens today, given the mechanisms of genetics that we can observe and understand? No, that's not possible. There's something missing in there where either there's some miraculous intervention to increase diversity, there's mechanisms that were operating then that are no longer operating that we can't observe. But given what we know and what we observe about genetics and genetic changes, that perfect starting state is not compatible with what we observe about modern human genetic
especially
variation. That's an important
especially
point.
when you toss in Neanderthals and Denisovans or Denisovans or however you want to pronounce that, and which are clearly more genetically diverse than the totality of all living people today. And so therefore that expands your range greatly in terms of the total amount of genetic diversity that must be included in the offspring of, in this case, Noah, since young earth creationists would say that all those other hominids are truly descendants of Adam and Eve.
Yeah. Okay.
So that just ups the ante in terms of the challenge that Dan just presented.
Yeah, I see. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So you said that it's possible for Adam and Eve to theoretically be created without these mutations that cause disease. You know, they were created perfect, so of course they didn't have disease, right? But then, of course, sin occurred, but it's still not, morally wrong for God to create them in this situation where they have incest because of this genome that was perfect to begin with, and there's no diseases yet, basically. But my question for both of you is there a hypothetical situation where it is possible for two parents to have no mutations to have a child that has no mutations as well?
Yeah, in general, everybody, so the kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about like individual little mutations, it's called SNPs is the way you said it. It's SNP is the abbreviation. It's single nucleotide polymorphism. And that's just a really long, complicated way of saying one base, one letter, ATCG in your DNA has changed to a different one. So, 99% of humanity will have a T, right, at a specific place. But for whatever reason, you have a G, right? So that's a SNP. That's a single nucleotide polymorphism. And everybody has a bunch of these. Everybody has a lot of different SNPs in their genome. And everybody, I can't say everybody with, 100% certainty, but the vast majority of people carry a handful of recessive genetic disorders. And when I say carry, I mean they have one allele for the disorder. So they don't have the disease, whatever it is, whether it's cystic fibrosis or whatever else. They don't have the disease because they have one version of that gene that works correctly, and they have one gene that doesn't work, so they're fine because you need two broken ones to have the disease. And, we've documented, I don't even want to put a number on it, thousands of recessive genetic disorders. And for many, there's lots of different specific mutations that lead to the same disorder. So everyone carries one or two or five of these things. It's going to vary, per person. Everybody carries a handful. The likelihood of bumping into somebody and having kids with them that happens to carry the same 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 thing that you carry is pretty low, right? But Everyone carries
I
But
come into my genetics
yeah.
class and I often, will start out a day, our conversation and say, like, I look out here and every single one of you is carrying a gene that if you had two copies of that gene, you wouldn't be in this room. I mean, you all
Mhm.
are carrying around deleterious alleles.
Hmm.
Um, but back to your original question, it's sort of like, if you started with a perfect, I want to back up in a few minutes and talk about what perfect means, because I think we still need to talk about this word deleterious
Okay.
versus disease versus just what are different traits. I think the line between those two isn't
Mhm.
necessarily as clear as some people think it is.
Okay.
But now I forgot what I was saying. All right, what was I saying?
Everyone carries
Oh
stuff,
yeah, yeah. So
and
everyone, that if you start out with two individuals that have, even if they started with Adam and Eve, clearly they must have had differences, right? I mean, if they were different genders and they look differently, they must have some differences in their DNA, at least on that sex chromosome. And so when they go to have offspring, they're going to have to mix those in some way. They're going to have a new combination. Now, we wouldn't necessarily call that errors, but it is a different set of DNA in the next generation than there was there before.
Okay.
And what Dan's talking about is like it's really impossible to copy that much of a genome without making mistakes. So you make individual single mistakes, but you're also crossing over sections and you're exchanging
Mhm.
genetic material that creates new combinations that didn't exist before. And so to say it's going to continue to be perfect would also suggest that whatever combinations you make somehow are still that particular new combination of alleles, genetics, that are now different than Adam and Eve, somehow is still perfect for the environment in that particular context. That's just not biologically realistic to think that you're going to continue to copy the same organism in such a way that even if you re-scramble the order or the different alleles and have new combinations of alleles, you're going to have new variations of organisms that are going to look different. And all you might say the spice of life is variety, and that's wonderful and beautiful and all. The word perfect is kind of a weird word. I mean, if there's one variation that does one thing and another variation that does something else, how are both of them perfect? That word is really hard to define. They both can't be absolutely ideal for the environment, unless they're truly neutral. And we've had that, Dan and I, we've had that discussion about neutrality a lot. But if they're truly
Mhm.
neutral with respect to, like, it doesn't matter if I have, you know, curly hair versus straight hair, then you might say to yourself, well, that's a variant. They're both perfect for this environment. But most traits don't, they're not really indistinguishable with respect to their condition in the environment. Um, and so we might look at them as diseases, but there are many characteristics that are in a way a disease in one environment, but not a disease in another environment. It's something it would be, well, I mean, having blue eyes appears to be a mutation, right? Appears to be a new variant in the human population, not in the original population. Um, and so some people, you might view that as neutral, but there might be a positive or negative aspect to that depending on how it interacts with the environment.
Okay.
Lactose
So yeah.
intolerance, that's another mutation that can have a positive benefit or possibly a negative benefit in some environments.
So just for clarity, could you explain why you keep referring to this idea of an environment when I guess the young Earth paradigm is thinking of, just the mutations that are like cause diseases, right? Um, why do you why what's so special about this environment when I guess the typical young Earth creationist is thinking of diseases? Are those the same thing, or explain if you could?
Um, yeah, go ahead, Dan, if you have that.
I was so I'll say they can be the same thing, and Joel kind of started going down this road a minute ago, where it's the line between something that is beneficial versus harmful versus disease causing. there are some cases that are very clear cut, right? Like cystic fibrosis. Well, actually, that falls into the second example I was going to use. So no, we'll use PKU as an example. This is a metabolic condition where you can't break down certain thing in your food, and if you eat a lot of that thing and you can't break it down, it leads to a toxic byproduct that affects your central nervous system. So like it's a recessive condition. There's, as long as you have one working gene for this metabolic pathway, that step in it that breaks, like, you're good. If you have two broken genes for that step in the pathway, you have this condition called PKU. That's going to be what it is pretty much wherever you live in the world, right? That's just how it is. But something like sickle cell, where we talk about sickle cell as like sickle cell disease is a disease. If you're homozygous for sickle cell, right, you have two versions of that hemoglobin gene that don't work correctly. You have sickle cell disease, and that's really bad. But if you live in an area where malaria is endemic, it's really beneficial to be heterozygous for sickle cell, to have one copy of hemoglobin that doesn't work correctly and have one copy that does. That's enough to prevent you from having sickle cell disease, and it also makes you resistant to some forms of malaria. So we talk about like created perfectly and then mutations occurring after the fall, right? Well, one thing, and Joel, correct me if I'm mistaken in my understanding here, because this is not my thing. I'm speaking well outside of my expertise here, but that's where disease would have come into being, where you previously wouldn't have had infectious disease, and then at some point, infectious disease becomes a thing. Well, now you have this mutation that makes the hemoglobin not work, but in the context of this one specific infectious disease, having one copy of that allele for that disease makes you resistant to the disease, to the infectious disease. So you have the genetic disease and the infectious disease, and being heterozygous for the genetic disease makes you resistant to the infectious disease. So is that a beneficial allele or is it a harmful allele? It's certainly disease causing, but if you live in an area where there's malaria, it's way better to have that trait in your population than not, right? It makes you way less susceptible as a group to malaria.
Yeah, so the disease, I mean, both like Ken Ham and other young earth creationists would say, like, well, that disease couldn't have existed, right? The organism that causes sickle cell disease wouldn't have caused that particular condition prior to the fall. So it was a perfect organism at the time. Whatever organism that was, it had some other responsibility.
Do you
Go ahead.
Do you mean malaria? Do you mean the parasite that causes malaria?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha.
So I should have said that more clearly. The parasite that causes malaria wasn't a parasite, in the original creation, because it also would have been perfect. All right. So then it had a mutation, which then presumably had some kind of mutation, which led it to a parasitic life cycle style. And then human beings had a mutation as well that sort of adapted to this new parasite in its environment. I mean, that's just adaptive evolution of mutations happening and natural selection choosing upon those mutations to find solutions to the problem that they're faced with. And the solution is this malaria parasite is out there now, causing disease. So it's really tricky. So was that particular? I think I've seen younger creationists suggest that the both alleles existed in the original human population, but somehow didn't cause sickle cell disease. I don't know how that would happen. Right? I don't know how that would work.
Yeah,
so I think they have to assume that.
Okay.
I think that they would have to assume that that's a mutation. So that's a new allele in the human population, but that new allele has a positive benefit. And I think the reason there's resistance to doing that is because they don't want to admit that's a beneficial allele. But it is only beneficial in a particular environment. So getting back, Zach, to your thing, that environment is an environment where there's a lot of malaria, right? Where there's a certain mosquito, which is carrying that malaria parasite. And if you live in an area where that parasite doesn't exist, then that particular allele in the human population is not a good allele to have in the human population because it's causing disease for some individuals. Mm-hmm. So we're back to the trade-off thing. There in some environments, an allele is good, and in some environments, the allele is not good, which is why it's really hard to envision, like, here's an original environment, the Garden of Eden. And as nice as you want to think it is, there is temperature, there is moisture, there are other organisms, you're eating food, there is different amounts of oxygen. Some alleles are going to be better than other alleles. And presumably, if you moved around the garden, you would experience different conditions, even within some area. And some alleles would be better in one condition than another condition. So it you can say like, well, this organism is perfectly made to adapt to different environments because they have genetic variation. Well, it's just another way of saying like there's a lot of genetic variation, and not all of that is beneficial alleles in every single environment.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we can even, because again, this is biology, we could even go further into that wide gray expanse between like good
Yeah.
and bad, right? We could go even further in there, and to what I talked about a little while ago with skin color, where like if you live at a latitude that is at a mismatch to the amount of pigmentation in your skin, you are either going to be highly susceptible to skin cancer, or you're going to have a vitamin D deficiency if you don't take a vitamin D supplement, right? Is that a genetic disease? Is that a disease causing allele? Having dark skin but living at a high latitude, is that a disease causing allele? Not really. That's just like human variation, right? But that's going to be quite suboptimal for most of human existence, whether you're looking at a young Earth time frame or a standard evolutionary time frame. Living at the wrong latitude relative to your skin color causes a big problem prior to the invention of sunscreen and or vitamin D supplements, right? Like, is your skin color a disease causing allele? Not really. That's not how we think of that. But just having that variation mismatched with your environment is going to lead to diseases at a higher frequency than you would otherwise expect.
So I was going to ask, all right, what would the perfect genome look like, or I guess possible ways? But it sounds like you guys are saying the idea of the word perfect doesn't really make much sense. What is it? Does it
Yeah.
make any sense to say there is a perfect genome specifically for not having diseases that would make incest bad? Is that even a possibility at all? It doesn't have to be an extensive answer.
Yes, I mean, I guess you could say there you could envision maybe a group of alleles for every gene that don't have serious negative effects. I mean, there are variants that are all allow that individual to survive in an environment, maybe not quite as, in the same efficiencies, but they're not diseases that are going to cause a person to die or have, serious impediments to their life. And say like, okay,
Right.
this is the totality of the genetic variation of the species. I mean, we talk about that in biology all the time. Like, what is the total amount of genetic diversity that's sort of available to that organism at any one time? And you could say like, okay, there's a lot of genetic variation here, but none of it is a disease causing, like straight up disease, bad disease. I still don't know how to, there's going to be a gray area, between that. But you can say like that's your starting point, and then maybe you would then introduce new mutations, but those new mutations would be taking those variants and pushing them out farther away from the whatever the boundaries of perfect are, which sounds so silly to
Right.
say, but the boundaries of variation within which you would live a happy good life. um,
I would think I would think, for example, that like you can identify recessive genetic disorders where there is no upside, where there's nothing called, it's called the heterozygote advantage, when if having one, I'll call it one bad allele and one good allele, right? If that is beneficial, like the malaria resistance, that's called
yeah.
a heterozygote advantage. There are definitely recessive genetic diseases for which there is not a heterozygote advantage, right? So if we could draw a line around a gene pool that excludes those disease causing alleles that don't in some contexts have a benefit to them, that we could maybe call like your very good or your perfect gene pool. It wouldn't even be a genome though, because there's still going to be variation there. It would have to be a gene pool for the population. But here's the thing with that type of thing where you exclude those very clearly harmful alleles, you would still let in things like sickle cell because there's a heterozygote advantage, or even cystic fibrosis. There's evidence of a heterozygote advantage with regard to being resistant to cholera for that one. So, like, you're still in that hypothetical situation where you can very clearly identify certain alleles that have no upside. They just cause disease and they're bad, right? Even if you exclude all of those within your gene pool now, you still have alleles in there that cause disease. They just might also have an upside in certain contexts. Do you exclude those?
Yeah, I'll just toss another one in. It's a little bit controversial because there's a lot of discussion about this, but the Alzheimer's allele, the so-called Alzheimer's allele, it doesn't cause Alzheimer's, but it is statistically at times associated with it. But there's actually three alleles, but two main alleles. And one of them, which is associated with a higher prevalence of getting Alzheimer's later in your life, also is associated with, if you have that particular allele, you have less chance of having congestive heart issues. I mean, basically it lowers your cholesterol level, right? So you potentially have a more healthy, younger life if you have the Alzheimer's gene, but nobody wants to have Alzheimer's, right? But there is a trade-off there in that you could consider that particular allele to be potentially a better allele at one. So it's not even just different environments. The environment is, when I'm younger, this gene's doing something better for me than the other version I could have gotten from my parents. But when I got older, it flips around and now it's the other way around. So how are you going to avoid that particular allele? You know, if it's created in the population, how do you account for genes that are good and bad at different portions of a person's lifetime? You know, so if you start having to toss out all those as well, then you get down to a much more, select set of alleles. And eventually what you have to do, I think, is you have to say that, well, after sin entered the world, God just changed the nature of what some genes do. And like, you start ending up having all these ad hoc hypotheses about how there's just like miraculous intervention to change the nature of those things, just like maybe the nature of organisms becoming parasites. And besides, you wouldn't need some of those alleles originally if there were no parasites. And so in a way, mutations become necessary after the fall because other organisms have changed their nature, right? So the environment has changed greatly with respect to the organisms around Adam and Eve. So therefore, if they didn't have mutations, they wouldn't actually be able to accumulate variations that allow them to survive better in that new environment, even though some of those mutations have a negative effect upon them. I mean, it just gets incredibly complex.
Yeah, very fascinating. Okay, so this is just my thoughts. All right, this might be a silly question. So Adam and
We say in
Eve
class there are no silly questions.
No, okay, we'll see
It's
about
not
that.
true, but we say it all the time. But
Yeah,
go for it.
you said that last time on the show. I learned my lesson. Nice try. So Adam and Eve and their family, all right, they're kicked out of the garden or whatever point that they had kids, not terribly clear. But either way, they're kicked out of the garden and they're having a bunch of kids. You're talking about, like, hypothetically, there was a solution to this whole perfect genome idea that got like, beat all of your best objections. Okay, they get out of the garden and like, is there any hypothetical plausible scenario where, like, this lack of genetic diversity just doesn't kill them all? Like, is that a legitimate threat?
Yes.
That is a legitimate threat. Yes. There is a concept in kind of population genetics. So there's two related concepts. There's this thing called the effective population size, which is different from what we call the census population size. Census population is just how many individuals are there. And then effective population size, there's a couple different ways you can define it. But basically, it's about how many individuals are reproducing and what's the genetic diversity of your population. So you can have, for example, a significant census population size, But if you went through what's called a bottleneck in the past, where only a few individuals survived, everyone's going to be pretty genetically similar on the other side of that. So you could have a population expansion and still a relatively small effective population size. And the threat there is this concept called an extinction vortex, which is where, because you have lower genetic diversity, right? Because you come from a small group, you have low genetic diversity, and some of those alleles that are present are going to be these recessive disease causing alleles. Even if they don't kill you if you have the disease, you're just less able to compete in your environment. You get less resources, you have fewer kids, and as a result of that, the population gets smaller instead of bigger. And this amplifies your problem because now inbreeding is going to be more likely. You're going to have more individuals that have the recessive genetic disorders. You're going to have lower average fitness. Natural selection is not working as efficiently. Genetic drift, which is random, which could result in the loss of good alleles that could help you, is exerting a larger effect. So it's this positive feedback loop of a population getting worse and worse and worse, and it's called an extinction vortex. And the fundamental problem at the start of this is a population that is below what's called the minimum viable population size. And that's a function of both the census population size, how many individuals are there, but it's also related to the effective population size. How genetically diverse is that population? And you can have a large census population, but if you have a small effective population size, you could still be below that minimum viable number and then kind of be on this fast track to extinction. That is a thing that we have observed in lots of kind of populations. I'll say natural populations, but a lot of them that like we have affected either through habitat loss or overhunting or whatever. And by the time we realize that, oh, they're going extinct, they're below this threshold, and there's no way to save the population.
Yeah, there's been natural populations that we've not affected that have gone through this that we've seen as well. I mean, like cheetahs are kind of this classic example of a what was once a larger population that got reduced to a small number. And in a way, you could look at that as a test case for, say, Noah bringing just a couple animals on the ark. Well, that's an extreme bottleneck. There's going to be very much reduced genetic variation. And then what you see with cheetahs is they've been, since that bottleneck, which is quite a long time ago, they've re-expanded their population. But if you look at all the individual cheetahs, they're kind of still clones of each other. There's not a lot of genetic variation there. And so although what we were talking about earlier, there's going to be new genetic variations, as you continue to, populate, there's going to be more deleterious like disease causing mutations, but it's going to take a lot longer to accumulate all the genetic variation you need to adapt in an environment. And so that puts them in a very dangerous situation. Okay, now, as long as the environment doesn't change and they're not, some new disease or something comes along that presents a new threat to them, not having a lot of genetic variation isn't like necessarily the end of the world. But what we're saying is that most organisms are going to experience a change in environment at some point during that species, history. And in order to be able to get through those difficult times, you need genetic variation in order to be able to adapt.
Okay, so it seems like there's a question of like morality for God with this whole incest idea. Like hypothetically, perfect genome is supposed to get past this, but it seems like you guys are saying there's an additional, I guess, hypothetical problem with God being moral, creating a situation where even if their genomes are fine, like for incest or whatever, once they get out of the garden, that there's still going to be additional problems with having this type of genome. Correct? Did I summarize that well, or is that how serious is that? Would you say? I guess.
Yeah. I mean it. Okay. Yes. If you're starting with the assumption of somehow perfection, there's going to be multiple issues like we've just talked about. I mean, a buildup of deleterious mutations, but there's also the reduction of genetic variation in a bottleneck of Noah's flood. And yeah, I mean, incest is like one of the, way down the list of problems, probably.
Interesting. Okay. That's a yeah.
I mean, honestly, inbreeding isn't always the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's not there are positive aspects to inbreeding as well from a purely biological standpoint. I probably shouldn't have thrown that in. That sounds
One
really
thing
bad, but it's
it's well, it's population genetics and evolutionary dynamics. Things are context dependent, and if you have a population that is relatively genetically uh, homogeneous, right, and it's well adapted to its particular environment, then in the absence of a significant fraction of recessive genetic disorders in that population, there wouldn't be much of a cost to it because you're basically staying the same and you're already well adapted to your environment, right? And you could have cases like that, and there are lots of like animal species that basically inbreed pretty consistently, and it's more or less okay. But applying that to something that is has relatively few kids, relatively long lifespan, right? Relatively slow population growth, then it becomes a problem. There's different strategies in terms of like population dynamics.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we talked about like Adam and Eve. You guys have mentioned the whole idea with Noah. So just for clarity, like Adam and Eve, they have kids, yada yada yada. The world becomes terrible. God sends the flood, and all it is Noah, Noah's sons, and the wives of Noah's sons, and the grandsons of Noah were on the ark. So they're all on the ark. They get off the ark, and that's 1,500 years of genetic mutations on the young Earth timeline. So it seems like they would also have to have incest right shortly after the flood because that's all the people that exist. Um, what possible problems does that bring into this situation that you haven't mentioned or want to go into more deeply?
So, assuming they have mutations, then you just increase the likelihood of recessive genetic disorders appearing relatively quickly, assuming somebody in that small group of people, because if you're looking at, that population size, it's Noah's three sons, because they're descended from Noah and Noah's wife. So you got the three sons, is kind of on one side of things, your sum total of genetic variation there. And then you have the three wives, and we don't know, their state of relatedness or anything, but like that's it. Those are the people you have to play with. So if we have recessive mutations that have kind of, been plucked in that bottleneck, then the likelihood of those actual diseases popping up within a few generations is quite high, right? Like almost one, given just how much inbreeding there would have to be there in that immediate post-flood population. But, and Joel, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but this is just something that since I read, we've been talking about this conversation. What if Noah, because we know that Noah, according to the narrative, lived for however many hundred years, right? So Noah had the long lifespan, and young Earth creationists, like, for example, Dr. John Sanford, have proposed that the decline in lifespans is due to mutation accumulation. So maybe, given that Noah had a long life, maybe Noah, and therefore his sons, were relatively, let's say, mutation free, or relatively few mutations removed from the created genomes in Adam and Eve, right? And then that gets you around the immediate like bottleneck issue, because we're just assuming that you're plucking the good alleles, right? By taking Noah, we're just assuming you're taking good alleles, but it doesn't get you around you're going to have mutations right after, especially because Noah's having kids into like however many hundred of year old, and there are other people in there that are also having kids at excessive ages. So you're going to have a lot of mutations cropping up in relatively short order in a rapidly growing population. And you've now taken your timeline by removing a bunch of diversity. If you assume Noah was basically had the lack of diversity of Adam and Eve, right? If you just project that forward about 2,000 years, now you've made how do you get the variation we observe in the present day worse, right? You've made that problem worse by making the genetic disorder problem better for Noah and his family. So
yeah.
no easy solution. No easy solution there, right?
Yeah, Zach, I don't know if you got that, but I think what Dan is
Sorry.
saying. No, it's good. It's really good. I think what Dan is saying is if Noah were really promiscuous, right? I mean, I guess it wouldn't be. I mean, depending on the rules. Incest was not a problem,
So we
right?
don't know how many kids he had.
But if he also had offspring with many, many, many other individuals. So he was the one donating most of the DNA for many hundreds of years. What Dan's saying is if he's the one donating that DNA, then there's going to be less mutation accumulation rather than going through many, 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 many separate generations of other individuals constantly passing things down and accumulating mutations. And so therefore that does push out the mutation problem just a little bit, potentially.
And also looking back before Noah, if we look at Noah and say, like John Sanford might look at Noah and say, well, he lived to, I don't know how long Noah supposedly, however many hundred years, right? Whatever it was. John Sanford, genetic entropy guy, might look at that and say, well, that's just evidence that Noah didn't have very many mutations. Right. So if we can just,
yeah, well,
so like
there's only like 16 generations.
The pre-flood population isn't a problem.
There's only, actually, maybe there's only 14 generations between Adam and Noah. So it's only 14 times. We were talking about a whole population, but in terms of one lineage, it's not that many generations.
Right. So you save yourself a little bit on the mutation problem. But it, like Joel said, it pushes it forward a little bit to after the flood. But not by
this
much.
Is all like, dancing around tiny little changes. Let me flip this all on its head a little bit. Like maybe a different way of like looking at it would be, okay, presumably other organisms are similar to us in terms of how they work biologically, right? How they function. And, if, Answers in Genesis would say all the other all the other kinds also were created with perfect genomes. So some of those other same kinds also, they all got bottlenecked, at least in terms of land animals. So if you take, Noah had that's multiple individuals make it through the flood. If you only have 2 individuals make it through the flood, and then they populate, well, you got 2 dogs or 2 canines, and then they not only become one species, they become 40 species, each of which has hundreds of thousands of individuals. If it were true that, incest and all these other things were huge problems and it's going to create massive problems, we should see it in those types of organisms. And yet we see 35 different living species today that are relatively healthy. And yes, they all do have mutations that have deleterious mutations within those populations. But here's the thing, they also mate with close relatives very frequently. I mean, there's a high level of inbreeding in some of those different organisms. And so even under those conditions of high inbreeding compared to what human beings have been, prevented from doing or been told not to do, if you just look at other organisms, they're not severely affected by that in those population numbers.
Okay, so animals are fun. All right. And that topic, a whole nother thing here. I read an article, journal article that was saying that some animals avoid inbreeding. So
well, yes,
that makes things difficult. But I guess maybe if there's only 2 animals, right? Is there some mechanism they're like,
there's a great
forget
desire
everything else. Yeah, forget everything else. We're just gonna do it.
Given any other choice, they're gonna the desire to breed is going to overcome the desire to find a mate that's outside of your own kin. Okay. And so there is biologically, and let's say natural selection has selected for pushing to try to find mates that are outside of your own close lineage, but that doesn't always happen. And in many cases, it doesn't. It's not. It happens in quite frequently. There's inbreeding. I guess my point is that if God is just giving us a new command because he's looking down on the world and he tells Moses, you know what, I foresee a problem coming here. These mutations are building up. In order to protect you from damaging yourself, I'm going to give you this new law. And this new law will help protect you from genetic damage and at least help human beings be a little less disease ridden than they are already. Whereas looking at all the other animals, that law doesn't seem to apply to them, but they're not any less healthy than human beings are because they weren't given that law. They're not doing that. They're doing more incest, and yet they're not really suffering anymore for it. So I personally don't think that God is giving us Levitical laws like hand washing in order for people not to get cholera. It might be a side benefit of that, but the purity laws aren't like a scientific thing. They're not I understand, you don't understand these diseases. You can't see bacteria. You don't know about these things. So I'm giving you special knowledge, not without telling you, by making these laws. You'll then obey these laws, which are then protecting you from yourself, from your environment. I think they have theological reasons for those particular laws and sociological reasons for how people interact with one another. And there's meaning in that. And if there's a secondary benefit, that's not the original benefit. That's not the original reason for those laws.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And that could be a fun discussion as far as, where there's laws even come from. Like, why do some of those laws show up in other texts outside the Bible and all that fun conversation? But I think that pretty much
Get
answered
to
all
the
my
science.
questions.
Sorry.
Yeah. Right. Um, okay.
I actually have. I just want to say on that issue.
Okay.
No comment.
All right. So I think that pretty much answered all my questions there. So any things that we haven't mentioned, I guess views that you've heard from, I don't know, maybe young Earth creationists or whatever that might be worth mentioning here. Anything else worth to add?
I will just say briefly that I think a significant fraction of the kind of work that comes out of what you call scientific young earth creationism, a lot of the kind of various hypotheses that come out of like Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries International, those groups and the people affiliated with them, a lot of that work is to deal with what we've been talking about and how do you reconcile a recent creation 6,000 years ago, a bottleneck 4-ish thousand years ago with what we observe in like the modern landscape of human genetics now, and how do you get those things to be compatible with each other? And there have been a lot of proposed solutions to that question, concepts like created heterozygosity, or one specific one is called patriarchal drive, which Joel alluded to earlier. It's this idea of germline mutation rates in males that accelerate as they get older. So you've got hundreds of men who are hundreds of years old fathering children that have dozens of times more mutations than we observe in older fathers in the present. It is given all of those different ideas and concepts to try to get you from a literal biblical kind of history for humanity to modern human genetic variation. It is difficult to reconcile those two things without appealing to mechanisms of genetics that are unobserved. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Creationists are still waiting around for new genetic principles to be discovered. And some will admit that. We can't explain this yet, but hopefully we'll find some mechanism that we didn't previously understand that might explain that.
Yeah.
I would go back to something you actually asked, Zach, which we didn't answer, which was, here you have maybe Adam and Eve, and they're in this garden, but outside the garden, that's the whole question is like, is the garden the whole world? And many young earth creationists view the garden as a specific place, but they also don't view the rest of the world as being really any different. They view it all as being like a similar environment, like maybe a single continent, and everything is like a nice, comfortable temperature, and there's consistent rainfall, and there's going to be plants and fruit trees everywhere. In which case, that makes it a little easier to envision like the perfect genome, because whatever set of variation exists in the original created kinds kind of works like everywhere they could go, because everywhere is kind of similar. But that is all. I mean, there's nothing like in the Bible that says that is the way that the whole earth is, that there isn't any variation. And of course, I think, Zach, I would argue that outside of the garden is a very different place, is the wilderness. And so you had said, like, what if, when Adam is cast out of the garden, if he's cast out into a different place, where thorns and thistles are growing, and there's going to be obstructions to the congenial environment that they were in before. Well, that's a different environment, which means that they're going to be not adapted for that environment in the same way they were to that other environment. And that's true for all other organisms as well. It suggests there's variation on the earth.
Hmm.
The other thing is, and this is really the central thing, it really comes down to this. We're trying to fit everything into this idea of starting with perfection and that there was no disease at all, and then saying disease is entered and then sort of accumulates over time. I mean, that is the model, right? That young Earth Christians are presenting. And I completely agree with Dan about when you start with that, and then you look at what we know about how genetics works and how populations function, and all these trade-offs, and how, well, really how biology works. It's very difficult to imagine how that scenario plays out, from even having something perfect to getting where we're at now. That has a multitude of problems. But I would just point out Adam was not made in the garden, right? He was formed outside the garden and he was placed into the garden. Um, and coming from outside the garden means that he comes from the wilderness. And the whole idea of creation is that it's not a like finished product. It's something that's in process. And so being in process is just what all organisms are doing. They're all in the process of adapting and changing over time, to changing conditions. And so we're human beings, have a place, in that creation, and they had a certain role to play in the garden, and that's just an area of communication with God. And had they played that role correctly, maybe they would have a chance to, influence some of the rest of the world in a different way than they are now. But as it is, they're kind of cast out of that garden, and they're part of this world, the world that's full of thorns and thistles, right? The world that's full of challenges. And it's a good thing we have variation, because we need that variation for meeting those challenges.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
that's my really
There you go.
super quick sum up.
I appreciate that. All right. So you mentioned it. Both of you guys mentioned it briefly. Um, the idea of like, okay, there's mechanisms that maybe we don't know, and that's what we're missing. That's why we can't explain it yet. Um, like, for someone that doesn't know much about science, which is most of my audience, um, like, is this something where we know a lot about genetics, and you're like, this just like from a scientist, you're thinking like, hey, this doesn't make any sense how there could be anything that we're missing here, or like, is it possible? Do we learn things new every day that maybe possibly could change this conversation? Like, what are the real chances of us finding something new about that?
Dan, you want to speak to that?
So, yeah, so I'll put it this way. As a kind of first principle, we are learning new things. I don't know about every day, but like we know a lot more as we sit here in 2024. We know a lot more about genetics and the human genome than we did in 2020 or 2010 or 2000, 1990, right? We knew a lot more in 1990 than we did in 1970, 1960. We knew a lot more then than we did in 1940 or 1930. Um, what all of those new things we have learned, though, we're kind of converging on what we think is a more complete understanding of how genetics and evolution and human genetics all works. And I think in order for a young Earth creation model to be correct, basically, I won't say all, because I'm sure you could reconcile some of it, but the vast majority of what we know about how this stuff works would have to be wrong. We would have to be wrong about most of this stuff, about very basic things like the rate at which mutations occur and the effects of mutations. We would have to be wrong about that in a very fundamental way. We would have to be wrong about basic things like how natural selection and genetic drift work, about how the process of recombination works when two people have kids and their genes kind of recombine in their offspring. These are things that are very well understood, with decades and in some cases over a century of findings behind them. And we would have to be significantly wrong about a lot of it in order to have a plausible mechanism to get from, for example, Noah's family and whatever their plausible genetic makeup was to what we see in the modern world in terms of human genetics and human variation. I think is how I would put that.
I
Any
can't
thoughts
really
there?
add to that.
Yeah.
That sums it up pretty well. I mean, the danger of, it sounds like you're in an ivory tower sometimes. I'm glad you asked that question, Zach, because it sounds like, oh, you scientists are saying that, something new could be found. Well, yes, but kind of no. I mean, it's like,
It would have to overturn let me put it this way by analogy. It would have to be a larger break with what we understand about biology now to get us to where that is a plausible scenario than Einsteinian physics was in terms of its revision to Newtonian physics. It would have to be
yes,
a
yeah,
larger change than that by by orders of magnitude. It would have to be bigger than that, right? Because like when you look at the progression of physics from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics to quantum physics, it's we're closing in again kind of more specifically on a more complete understanding, and it's not so much that like relativity overturns Newtonian physics as it just adds complexity to it. And that's the same way that the field of biology has grown since the mid 1800s when it really matured as a field. um, and everything we've learned since then, it's pushing us and pointing us in this direction of having a more complete understanding of how these processes work. And we're not just talking about, oh, we're going to add new layers of understanding to it. We're going to add new processes that add complexity and show us that our previous understanding was simplistic. We would need new things that show us that our previous understanding was 180 degrees
yes.
wrong.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean, those are some pretty big claims. So, yeah, once again, I do appreciate both you guys coming on here. It's been a very fascinating and interesting subject. Um, both of you guys, if you would, Dan and then Joel, point people to your channel, what you talk about, and just like an advertisement for why you should check out your channel.
Sure. Hi. My channel is called Creation Myths. It's about creation and evolution, and I focus on creation science and scientific creationist hypotheses like genetic entropy or irreducible complexity. You may have heard some of these words, people watching this. And I try to evaluate them as kind of legit scientific hypotheses and show where the problems are. I also periodically host interviews with professional creationists. Most recently, I had Paul Price on. I've had Dr. Michael Behe on. I've had a bunch of people on over the years that we always have fun conversations. So that's what I do. The channel is called Creation Myths, and join me if you want to talk more about biology and evolution and creationism stuff.
And my station's called Joel Duff, just my name. And I cover a smattering of different things that are just things that are very close, near, and dear to me, but mostly coming from being a pastor's kid, being, in the church, but being around young earth creationism all my life. I've had an intense interest in this intersection of, how science, and I'm a scientist, right? I'm a professor of biology and I teach genetics and other courses. And so I guess I have a heart for people that struggle with this topic that are within the Christian church and have difficulty understanding topics like this whole topic you were just discussing here tonight. And so wondering how we can understand science and have an appreciation for science without being necessarily like completely scared off by it because we feel like it's incompatible somehow with scriptures. But I also talk about my own struggles with questions I have because I don't have all the solutions. And I think it's important for people to see how somebody else works through those things, trying to understand what they know about science and how they interact with other people. And I'm also interested in just the communication of science to the public and to my fellow Christians for the appreciation of understanding this world that we live in.
Awesome. All right. So if you could sum up the arguments that you've made in this discussion in 1 minute, just very quickly, could you do that real quick here?
Dan, you go first.
Sure. Okay. There are two big questions here, I think. The first is, could you theoretically create, could God theoretically have created two individuals with perfect genomes, however you would define that? Yes, that is a theoretical thing, right? God is omnipotent. Sure. You can make that happen. The second question is then, what are the consequences of that? And can we reconcile that with what we know about how genetics works and the current human genetic landscape, population genetics, level of variation that we see. And that is a much more difficult question. And I think the answer is basically no, right? Given what we know about genetics and inheritance and evolution and human genetics, it is not currently possible to reconcile a recent creation of, Adam and Eve with perfect genomes with existing humans plus also Neanderthals and Denisovans that you have to account for, right? How you get from A to B requires something outside of the mechanisms that we know, that we've documented, that we've observed. So currently it is not possible to get from A to B given the mechanisms that we have to do it.
Yeah,
I think that's the two big questions. Could you make it? Yes. Can you get from there to here? No.
that's a great summary of the scientific challenge. And that comes from the assumption of that the interpretation of scriptures is the young earth creationist interpretation. But I'll admit that I'm a little frustrated that the broader church and even old earth creationists, maybe evolutionary creationists and so forth, that may have different views of their understanding of Genesis, kind of fall into the trap that I think that has been set by young earth creationists. Because whenever I look to see how people respond to this particular question, they typically do this thing where they think of Adam and Eve as being perfect, as in like somehow they have these perfect genomes with absolutely nothing wrong with them. And I'm not sure that that is really a proper biblical assumption. So it kind of gives it away. It's kind of like saying the original creation and all other animals were also perfect, and so there wasn't any kind of like death or decay or anything in that world. All of that biologically is difficult to understand when you start to really think about the complexity of what a world looks like, what the ecology of a world looks like that has that kind of perfection. And so I think that just honing in on this question and seeing how biologically difficult it is a way of showing that we need to think about other explanations for the diversity we see in organisms and its origins.
Hmm.
I'll just leave it at that. We can have
Okay.
another discussion, Zach, about that another time.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, both of you guys. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thank you.